This next topic, it's an excellent, match for the to come next, for the CTEPH guidelines that Dr. Helmersen alluded to. Dr. Helmersen is a distinguished respirologist from the U of C who is the lead for the CTEPH guidelines.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. I think it'd be help to exit out of your slide here. Okay, well, thanks again for the opportunity of presenting on another collaborative project. I think many of you in the room have been involved in CTEPH guidelines from the beginning with our paper in 2010 and then the work we've been doing now over the last 3 years on the guidelines update. And if you haven't been involved, if I have sort of one area of success today, I want to sort of leave it that we can encourage more people to be involved that aren't involved in this process. Some of you will be asked to be reviewers of this process and document, and then it's also, we hope, going to be an iterative thing where we, once we have guidelines that are updated and evidence-based, that we maintain those on an ongoing basis. So what's new in 2018? So as mentioned, many of you are involved in this guidelines document. So this was the first guidelines that our Canadian PH community published in 2010. So thanks to Sanjay's leadership and a lot of corralling people together in rooms and learning this process of guidelines. Having said that, it's also been 8 years since this has occurred, and the field has evolved quite rapidly. There's an avalanche of new data in this area, and certainly a recognition that we need to provide updated guidelines. So one of the questions is sort of, amongst all the other things that we can prioritize as a Canadian PH community, why should guidelines be high on our list? And there are a few reasons for this. Some of these pertain to the reason that we chose CTEPH as the first disease area to focus on for PH guidelines in Canada, but it's not unique to CTEPH. There are other areas of PH where there are care gaps and have rapidly evolving technologies. But certainly those are some of the reasons why we chose CTEPH to focus on initially. Another important reason is, particularly within the CTS, there's a lot of experience with the methodology guidelines. The CTS are world leaders, initially in the COPD and asthma area, in the methodology used to take evidence and move towards guidelines that can be implemented to improve patient care. So we've certainly learned a lot from our colleagues in COPD and other areas, and we really can piggyback in terms of the expertise and resources that CTS has to help us with these guidelines. I'd also like to make the case that our guidelines are really important to do because they complement what's happening elsewhere in the world. A lot of people have asked, well, why are you doing this? Because the ERS or ISHLT or other groups, WHO, have their own position statements and guidelines, and where is this going to fit in? But really the process that's being used through the CTS is different than some of those other societies. And I think a lot of us feel that this work really complements what's being done by those other bodies. And the goal really is to have a document that primarily helps Canadians and helps us as a group of Canadian practitioners, but also is internationally recognized and can help our colleagues and patients outside of Canada. And finally, why else do we do this? Well, I think we enjoy working together. We've got a good team and work well together. Except for that Meta guy, he's kind of tough to work with sometimes. But yeah, it's a great opportunity to get together. And obviously lots of work that happens through email and phone webinars and things like that, as well as face-to-face meetings. So where do things sit now? So it's been about 3 years that we decided that we should provide an update on our CTEPH guidelines, in part because of the rapid development of new technologies for imaging and new techniques for treatment in CTEPH. So we've got a committee of many of you in the room here, people from many parts of Canada that are involved in bringing together a working group for our guidelines update. The questions we're focusing on, we're trying to span areas we think that are pertinent to the entire disease area, from screening to diagnosis to various types of treatment. One thing that we've done differently with this guideline is the concept that as good as we are in Canada, and we've got broad expertise, we thought that it would be good to have some international experts on our panel, and this is to the extent that our experts providing meaningful impact, including voting on the recommendations. So we have two experts, one from the US and one from Europe, who have been really valuable contributors to the document so far. And so within each of these disease areas, we have specific questions that we think are key questions, which have focused our literature search and ultimately our recommendations. So to give you a sense of sort of what we did in 2010 and the big goal that we had of doing in our update. So in 2010, as many of you recall, we published a paper with 20 recommendations. And that involved a structured literature search from we thought was sort of the beginning of a lot of the key literature in CTEPH in the 1960s up until 2008. Our guidelines update sort of builds upon that, and then we have evaluated the literature from 2008 to the end of September of last year. And in 2010, we ended up having 26 recommendations for those 20 PICO questions. And I can tell you with our guidelines update, it's looking like we'll have around 20 recommendations for the 13 PICO questions that we thought are currently most pertinent to this disease area. This is a huge amount of work. Each PICO question is a huge project in itself. And one of the challenges we've had is keeping an updated sense of the data and the literature, but then also having time to move forward with the proper structured process of crafting recommendations. So one of the decisions that we've made sort of last year is to divide this work into two separate projects. One, a diagnosis paper, and we really have 4 questions currently focused on diagnosis, and then a treatment paper, which the goal is to have that published subsequently. So the guidelines process, as led by the CTS, is a fairly lengthy process, and this is sort of a snapshot of what that looks like. The first step is to get approval and ultimately key resources from the body that supports this. And some of the key resources are the people at CTS that are experts in helping with the methodology and literature searches, et cetera. And so this is when Steve Provencher was in the pulmonary vascular lead, and Sanjay, they sort of lobbied hard, and we put applications in and ultimately succeeded in competing with other disease areas for some CTS resources for this specific project. Next step is to create the working group, which, as I showed, sort of many members. We try to balance it in terms of geography and also expertise. You know, we've got Mark as a surgeon, we've got chest radiologists, cardiologists, respirologists. Formulating the PICO questions, and these need to be updated periodically as the disease field changes. And then into the meat of the work, which is the literature search, the screening of abstracts based on the literature search, and then extraction of data from the full text articles, which can be a little tedious, and before you can get to the fun part, which is appraising the evidence. As we'll get to, there's another step when there's not a lot of evidence for a particular question, then you're still able to use a structured process to use clinical judgment from the expert panel. And then ultimately crafting recommendations, many steps for peer review in this stage. That's sort of one of the things I think I'd also hope for today is some constructive comments from the group. And then finally, knowledge translation, sort of as Nathan mentioned, is a key part of any statement or guideline. And one of the things we probably recognize that we didn't pay as much attention to in 2010 as we would have liked to. So this year, we're looking for really meaningful KT and a lot of work in that area, looking for ideas as to what's going to make that effective too. So that was our plan, was that we thought, oh, 2015, we'll get the group together and bang out these guidelines within a year. And we've hit a few pitfalls along the way. From here to Whistler, I guess, is maybe the goal. And we had challenges, even simple things like getting libraries to give full text articles because of the copyright laws, and then trying to determine how you extract the data. We used 2 independent reviewers when we're extracting data. And there was some staff changeover at the CTS. So those are some of the pitfalls, but we're sort of on the home stretch here. And one of the other things we noticed is just the increased amount of publications in this area. I suspect you could take other areas in PH and see the same thing, where just an explosion of papers, and this is just CTEPH as it relates to the increased number of publications year over year. I suspect this trend has continued since 2016. I'm just going to try to show you the tool that we've used. This sort of touches on the point that I maybe can I get some technical help? I just have a Word document I want to bring up here. Let me see if I can get this up on the screen. That's great. So this is just to touch on sort of the point that I brought up to Nathan and Lisa, is that I think what you guys were doing in the position statement is exactly what the structure would tell us to do and what we did in the guidelines, which is, and this is, I'm not sure if you can read that, but this is an example of one of our PICO questions, which is, should all patients with PH be screened for CTEPH? And this is one of the previous iterations of the recommendation, which was that in patients with CTEPH, perform a nuclear VQ scan to screen for the disease to improve outcomes. But then what the panel does is goes through some of these key items, both in terms of grading the body of the evidence, and there's some questions where you don't have much evidence, so you have a low grade body of evidence, the directness to which the evidence pertains to the question, but then other really important things like the health benefit to the patient, safety or harm to the patient, and this is where clinicians can bring their own clinical experience in, and in hopefully as an objective or separated from bias forum, be able to vote on how much they think that the certain intervention is going to be supported by the recommendation. Any other comments or questions about that? I mean, this is sort of one of the things I found really useful, and it generated lots of good debate when we generated our guidelines, and it was amazing how many areas that we didn't have good data for, but when you have experts in the room that say, yeah, we know there's not good data for IVC filters, but here's my experience in our institution, and other people sort of brought other experience to the table, that it was really, I think, a good scientific way to develop good recommendations. Okay, now I apologize, I have to go back to my slides.
Sorry.
Great, thank you. So to give you a snapshot in terms of where things sit, so we're close to, so we've finished our voting on the recommendations. We've got a manuscript that'll be going to some of you for peer review soon, and targeting a publication for the diagnosis paper by the end of the year. I'm not sure if you can read that, but it shows that we had over 500 full-text articles that we reviewed. When you divide the treatment and diagnosis sections at the bottom, you can see there were 71 articles that we reviewed in terms of full data extraction. One of the challenges is just the details of data extraction is quite cumbersome, and this is an area where we hope that in the future this will get more efficient. The CTS is kind of looking at new software that maybe takes some of this work away from the physician panel members and makes it a bit more automated, and that'll really help, I think, speed up the idea of guidelines development. And so this is where things sit. This will be the title of our updated guidelines when we have it ready to come out. Can't tell you too much more than that, other than to say that really the goal is for this to be an iterative process, and already thinking about the fact that there's literature that's come in from the end of September of 2017 that we're at some point going to have to look at reviewing and extracting the data. Really the goal, but I'll throw it out to the group to see if we can sustain this, but the goal is to not wait 8 years next time to update this, but to try to do it on an annual basis or every 2-year basis. And using some of these tools, it's a much more manageable amount of workload to look at the new data and see if it influences our recommendations. The thought is that these recommendations are going to be a living document, post on the CTS webpage. And so that sort of is the challenge, is the question of how do we sustain a rigorous process like this. Certainly, we've had a lot of positive comments, including from our international experts that comment that this is a more rigorous process than has been used by other bodies, and that's the answer to the question of, why are we doing this, and hasn't the ISHLT or WHO or ERS done this already? Well, no, we're doing it differently. And it's thanks to the huge commitment from the people that have devoted their time over the years. We desperately need new people, and so I think it was pretty open initially when we came up with our panel. Everyone in the community had a chance to participate. I'd like to have sort of another request for any interested parties to come forward as we're moving forward with the next phases of diagnosis and then the treatment guidelines. Definitely would like to focus on KT, looking for ideas as to what's going to be effective. A lot of this work has been done by our physician members, and with the help of the CTS, we haven't involved our allied health, but certainly I think there's huge opportunities for allied health nurses and other members to be involved, especially as it relates to KT. Looking for any other ideas people have to sort of help this move forward and help it succeed. So maybe I'll stop there. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I think I'd like to congratulate you.
Sorry, Mark, we should do it with the
Yeah.
microphone because we are recording. And you can just leave the microphone on, folks. It's not going to interfere.
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate you and everyone. It was a huge amount of work, and it's really, that's the big difference, I think, between the guidelines and the consensus to some degree is really the rigorous part that has to take place. To my knowledge, I don't think there's any other guideline specifically for CTEPH. I think that's the only one that is available in the world. And I wonder if there has been some discussion to have it endorsed by some other society potentially.
Yeah, a lot of discussion. I mean, this kind of is partly related to the KT piece because our target audience was general respirologists and general cardiologists, but a lot of discussions of, well, how do we partner with the radiology group or other groups to sort of help in knowledge translation? I don't know if other panel members want to jump in, but obviously part of our goal of involving Nick and Marion was to then engage other societies too,
And I think dividing it into two components is also very helpful. It's as well to keep it as a living document, I think, because these are fields that are evolving at different speed, and I think that will help in the future as well.
The knowledge translation, it's kind of a buzzword these days. Everybody knows that writes a grant. You better put something in there on how you're going to translate the knowledge and how it's going to improve care. I think the point is just that it's easy, not easy, it was a lot of work, but it's easy to write guidelines. You then have to get into the hands of people that are going to learn from them, hopefully, and then get to change their behavior to do what you're telling them to do. And that process is not happening. That's very clear. Implementation of guidelines doesn't happen for many reasons. People don't know about guidelines. They don't agree with the guidelines. They think it's too complicated. This is going to be probably a shorter document, but it's still going to be 25 pages. And so most people won't even read the whole thing. So implementation is a really important area. The guidelines process goes from development to dissemination to implementation to evaluation. We haven't even got to evaluation yet of whether they make a difference. Doug mentioned the CTS has expertise, lots of people that have worked in other respirology areas that are experts at this that we've learned a lot from over the years. And CTS has done a good job of the D&D. They haven't really done the implementation well, and that's where they're headed over the next few years to study what's the best way to implement it. Is it to give me a USB with the document and slides? Is it to send me emails repeatedly telling me what the guidelines say? And so those are all different forms of knowledge translation, and nobody knows what the best is. That's one of the challenges, but it's also an opportunity. They were thrilled when we did the first guidelines in 2010, and now they're happy that we're doing another one because it helps them say, okay, let's try these tools. And so we're open to any ideas that people have that think in their own practice would help them practice better and might help other physicians and healthcare workers practice better.
yeah, question.
I have a little recommendation. One of my recommendations, just because I know in our center we're going to obviously electronic health records. So one of my thoughts would be make it easy to put the guidelines automatically into electronic health records when you're doing assessments and stuff.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, certainly around some of our recommendations that are imaging based, there were a lot of discussions about that and partnering with imaging societies when they, are reporting a positive EQ scan, for example. Yeah. Any other ideas for KT? I mean, I can tell you that, so two of the things that are planned is there's sort of some practice surveys that we have planned for general respirologists, and then a slide set that maybe that could be shared with members in the PH community. And then I think we're looking for guidance. You know, our COPD colleagues did lots of good work with DNI, but Bob?
I think certainly we found here we had a PERT team created, and basically it doesn't have much to do with respirologists or pulmonary hypertension specialists. It's all about radiologists, and probably one of the most important groups to disseminate information to is radiologists who would trigger the correct action. And so I think the partnering with whatever, I don't know, academic organizations, do they have academic radiology groups? I don't know. But
Yeah, I think we're good. Like Carol Denny, I think she's the chair of the Canadian Thoracic Radiology group now.
But in the same way, I mean, at Vancouver General now, the CTologist is sitting there reading a CT scan, and they have triggers to actually activate the PERT team. And, you know, basically, I think that's what's worked effectively.
The other ideal group would be thrombosis clinics. I mean, I think that would be a good group to target to disseminate these. Certainly seeing them follow up after their acute PE, still dyspneic, I think it would be a great way to then trigger the VQ and the echo, which go on to make the diagnosis.
I guess I'm interested here. I know Anastasia and Mark are going to talk about future research in CTEPH, and you know, obviously monitoring, what Sanjay mentioned, sort of monitoring implementation is research. Great opportunities here of kind of evaluating the impact of guidelines. You know, one of the things that we learn from the guidelines process is areas for future research. So there's going to be sort of clearly areas there's no evidence for, and that really might help us as a group to prioritize what would be projects. You know, I think we're always interested in Canadian-wide projects, and then the question will be, what do we prioritize in CTEPH and all the research gaps. Sorry, Lisa.
Yeah, I was just going to say, on the KT piece, one of the things that we're doing in the heart failure guidelines, and I'm not sure if the needs assessment would be the same for this audience, but is to create a series of online CMEs based on the guidelines that are actually accredited, because there is a need for accredited learning modules, and I mean, I have my hats off. This has been one of the biggest projects that I've been involved in terms of this type of document, and you've done an incredible job putting it together, and I think there's going to be a ton of education and learning from it. So, I mean, again, if the needs assessment was there, then it's a lot of work, obviously, but it does get it to the people who are actually looking for the information, and they learn and they get their accreditation, and we get to know that the information is getting out there.
Great question. Yeah, I know the PHA in the States actually has sort of a CME component. Is there a thought or vision that in Canada, PHA Canada might get into that, or would this be in a different body?
I think, you know, PHA Canada is happy to do whatever we think will improve care. That's easy. Obviously, our focus is patients and caregivers, secondarily education and medical practitioners. But if you have an idea that we're happy to support it, absolutely. There's always some cost issues and human resource issues, but we can work through that on the board. Doug, I wonder if it'd be helpful to people to know that the CTS went through an evaluation process to pick CTEPH. Did you want to tell them a bit about the other areas of pH we've kind of sort of thrown around for tackling in terms of pH guidelines?
Sure, yeah. I mean, certainly not just CTEPH, but I think there were probably 15 or 20 other disease areas that were competing for the resources. And but certainly in terms of our pH clinical assembly, we had also talked about pH in the setting of lung disease, pH in the setting of left heart disease, and you know, those are sort of things we were going to talk about as a group. You know, it certainly highlights the need for multiple people contributing. I think the vision is that there's room for everybody to contribute, and you can have a group of people working on CTEPH and a group of people working on other disease areas, and certainly benefit from an opportunity of people to get together more regularly, and you know, whether it's at the CRC or meetings like this, to make sure you don't lose the momentum with the work. That was one of the problems we had between 2010 and 2018 is, unless people get together, you lose some of the momentum, so. We need lots of, certainly there's new practitioners in PH in Canada, and I hope to get emails from a lot of them soon. Okay, great, thanks everyone.